Hello, world. We're live. Welcome to the July 2024 edition of the Laravel Worldwide Meetup. I'm Dan Sapelsa. I'm a developer at Vehicle, one of your co-hosts, and along with my co-host, Margaret Tavares. We're very excited to once again bring you another talk from someone who's very involved in the Laravel community, sharing a lot of the great insight and knowledge that we're all so fortunate to be a part of in this community. Margaret, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Dan. Thank you so much for asking. What about yourself?
I'm doing great. We are in the thick of summer here in Canada and loving the weather and also loving some events that are coming up shortly actually. So that's before we get to our speaker Steve today, we have some housekeeping items and on that topic there's a lot of actually community related events coming up in the weeks and months ahead. So let's go through some of those. Margaret, what do you think?
For sure. Happy to run through some great Laravel resources and see what's new and happening in the Laravel community. So first up, of course, we got Laravel News. So big thanks to Jacob Bennett and Michael Drinda for hosting Laravel News. They have a great podcast and a weekly newsletter that's delivered via email. So if you want to check them out, check out laravel-news.com. And we have the Laravel podcast, which Matt Stauffer and Taylor Otwell will be actually doing all of season 6 together. So you want to check that out at laravelpodcast.com. As for Larajobs, if you haven't heard about this before, it's a great resource if you're looking to hire, looking to post a job. And for all your Laravel job needs, you can check them out at larajobs.com. As for some events that are happening, we have Laravel Live Denmark, so you can still get your tickets. This is the first Laravel conference held in the Nordic countries, so if you have the advantage to go there and attend, please do so. That's happening August 22nd to 23rd, so you can check them out at laravellive.tk. And as for the end of August, another event that's happening is Laracon US. So tickets are sold out, but we will be there. So we're very excited to see everyone and a great lineup of speakers. So again, if you want to find out some more information, you can go to laracon.us. As for some new events, this is a newer event that is going to be happening in November. So November 7th, you can, if you're a Laravel enthusiast or you're interested in Laravel and you live in Italy, you can go to Laravel Day. So it's the first all-Italian Laravel conference. It's offered online and in person. So if you don't have the luxury of being able to be in amazing Italy, you can check them out online and attend there. And you can check them out at laravelday.it. And as same day, November 7th, but also the 8th. So maybe you can check out that one. And this one, we got Laracon AU. So we have 17 speakers from across Australia and around the world. Tickets are on sale. It's going to be happening in Brisbane, Australia. So you can check them out at laracon.au. And for anyone that's local to Ontario, we have in the Greater Toronto area, but they're also hybrid. So if you're not in this area, you can still check them out remotely. This is a meetup group for all PHP developers. So you can check them out on Meetup. And of course, big thank you to our sponsor host. So thank you to Vehicle for their support in relaunching this whole meetup. They have a great team of developers. And if you have any Laravel problem, they'd love to help you out. So make sure to hit them up at vehicle.com. And we have a giveaway as well. So if you want to participate, big thank you to our sponsor, JetBrains, for giving a couple of one-year subscription codes to any JetBrains IDE. So winners will receive an email from our community manager, Lee. So watch out for that email, and you can scan that code and join before August 6th when we have the draw.
We're feeling good about that QR code today.
And I'll pass it back off to Dan to introduce our speaker for today.
All right. And that brings us to our speaker for today, a prominent Laravel community member, Steve McDougall. I was looking for a little bit more of an intro to Steve to kind of highlight some of the many things he's up to. And I found the perfect description on his little bio in Laravel News. Steve is a technical writer at Laravel News, a developer advocate at Treble, an API specialist, a veteran PHP/Laravel engineer, and a YouTube live streamer. And really excited Steve's going to join us today and talk about something that I think a lot of us do, at least parts of our application or all of our application is use Laravel to build an API. So really excited. Let's bring him in here. How you doing today, Steve?
Hey, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. Like I said, we're in the thick of summer here. How's the weather for you? You're in Wales, is that correct?
Yes, I am. I'm currently suffering Welsh internet. It is quite warm here today, so the internet's going a little bit wonky, but hopefully we should
the humidity in the pipes slows down the connection a little bit sometimes.
Yeah, it really does. Yeah. Anything other than a slightly rainy day and we suffer.
Awesome. Well, we'll bear with you. I think it's going to go really well. So I think we're all set here. So I think you've got sort of your screen to share there. So if you wanted to go ahead and share your screen, we can set you on your way. Margaret and I will kind of step backstage and
Awesome.
Excited to hear what you have to say about Laravel and building APIs.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do that. There we go. The sort of an inception thing here. I can see half terminal and half. There we go. All right. I think we're all set. Did you need anything else from us, Steve?
No, I am good. I'm good. I'm going to keep the chat open on my side in case anyone's got any questions, and we'll just go from here.
Awesome.
Well, yeah, we'll look through some questions and go through them at the end of your talk and whatnot. But also feel free if any point in your talk you want to stop and answer some questions. We're happy about that too. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat.
All right.
Will do.
Talk to you shortly.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for joining me. So we are here today to talk about performant APIs in Laravel. And I was creating slides, I was creating videos, and I was trying to find a nice way to kind of walk through how to do this. And I managed to make like an 8-minute video, but it just felt too fast-paced. So I wanted to take a step back and just walk you through it from a code perspective. So a good API is consistent, it's stable, and it's usually built in Laravel, right? Like we can all agree on that one. So let's scroll down. I'm imitating Taylor a little bit here, so we'll see how well it goes. So let's talk about API design. So there's this whole thing in the API community that you should be going API design first, and that's not strictly true. Now, a lot of us will just be building a quick API to add onto our application because we need it, or we might just have 1 or 2 relatively big-sized projects, but beyond that, it's just 2 APIs. What really works with design first is when you're in a really large organization and you're looking at 20, 30, 40 APIs at a time, and you've got this really mature process and this API-only team whose job it is just to discuss and figure out the API design. You don't need to worry about that. Yes, you should create open API specifications, but you don't have to create it before your code. In fact, I don't. All of mine are generated. So let's keep going. API design, we can worry about you later, right? So route management. This is the first thing that I find is very important with any Laravel project. So the way I like to do this is give myself some real estate here, is to start grouping things into a routes directory under API, and then I create this routes file. Now, this is what we usually see. We're used to seeing this in our routes file, and all is good. We've got this middleware, we're going to get users, but by the time you get to the point that you've got 30, 40, 50, 100 different routes on your API, the visual overload and the cognitive stress that just trying to find the right route can be, even with a Control F sometimes, it's just not worth it. So I like to do things a little bit different. And obviously I like to version my APIs. So what I tend to do is all APIs should be authenticated. There's no excuse. It stops bad actors. It helps with rate limiting issues. And it just makes things so much easier when you've got an API. Just authenticate everything. If you've got a public API, then still authenticate. And if you don't want to authenticate, then lean extremely heavily on something like Cloudflare is the only advice I can give on that one. So what I do is I prefix everything with a V1, give it a name as V1, and then start a group. I then start to create all of the different endpoints in groups as prefixes, and then create a new specific file. Because what this allows me to do is very easily copy this, come down here and say, okay, so now I'm going to create this V2. And here's my V2. And the only one that I want on V2 to start with is going to be the friends endpoints, because I'm going to iterate over that. And then I can keep this going for a little bit. I can monitor it, understand it. And then when I'm ready, I can just turn it off. And everything is migrated to V2. It keeps things really clean and really easy to work with. Let me just delete that second one there, and we're going to keep going. So let's work on conversations. Why not? So inside here, I've got this V1 directory, and here is where I keep all of the different routes. I've got conversations, I've got friends, and I've got messages. So if I come over to conversations, one of the important things that I always look at when I'm starting a new project or taking on an API is to look at this first index route. You know, it tells you a lot about the API. It tells you what options they've got, what standards they're following. Are they using pagination, authentication? What headers are they expecting? How do I need to start working with it? And it's the easiest way to get started without having to send payloads or anything. You can just jump in and start using it. So our index controller, typically it will look something a little bit like this. Maybe it won't be a final class, dealer's choice. You might not be returning a Symfony response. You might be returning something different. You might be returning a status. You might not be. But typically you want to be getting some data and you want to be returning a response. It's somewhat simple, right? But the biggest problem is it's not the cleanest way to do it. So I'm going to fake a few things for this. I'm going to remove this author. I know I just said that you should always authenticate, but for demo purposes, I'm going to remove the authentication. And I'm also going to just quickly migrate fresh and seed. So I need a user, okay? I can't do everything. It's a demo at the end of the day, right? So let's just grab my users. I'm just going to grab me as an ID. And we're going to hard code this, but ignore that bit, okay? Ignore the hard coded part because it's not meant to be hard coded. It should be auth ID, but beyond that, we'll ignore the other parts. Okay, so at this point, I should be able to make a request to my conversations and get a list back. So if I come over to Aspen quickly, I'm going to go to HTTPS. Then I'm going to go to chat.test. I'm going to go to V1 conversations. Headers, I'm going to want to accept application. If anyone's ever seen me live stream, then you'll know I make a lot of typos. I'm going to apologize about that in advance. So V1 conversations could not be found. So let's just go and API V1. 2 seconds. So I jumped ahead a step. So if you're building an API only application, then yeah, you pointed out. Thank you, Laravel Online. You caught me. So by default, you will always get that prefix of API, but you don't always want it. So if you're building a standalone API, then you can just pass through API prefix as an empty string, and you won't need to use it anymore. There we go. So now what I'm getting is I'm getting a list of conversations, and all is good, right? All is good in the world. I have got, lots of nice conversations. I've got 10. What more do I need? So from that point, I want to start thinking a little bit differently. So how can I start giving better responses? Haven't we all defined a public function? Oh my God. It always looks Spanish when I write function as a typo. It's like funzione. But anyway, better responses, our first step. So if we come back to this index controller, what we want to do is we want to start leaning on transforming our data into something that is standardized. And obviously, Laravel's got something built in that we can use. So if we say PHP artisan, we can make a resource. And we are going to call this a conversation resource. So now if we just take all of this data, what we can do is we can say conversation resource collection. You've got to love a little bit of PHP Storm AI there. It's actually quite useful compared to what I found the Copilot was. So what we're doing here is we're going to get a conversation resource as a collection. I'm just going to pass the whole thing in. Now, if we take another look at our data here, we'll see, okay, we're just getting the same thing in effect. So we need to work with that a little bit. So by default, this will just return an array. Let me just run Laravel Pint. And what I like to do is just add a quick read-only property of the model in question as a resource, because it helps with type completion a little bit. So what do I want to know? Well, I'm going to need to know the ID, right? So I can say this resource ID. A conversation has got a name, so I'm going to want that. And it's also got a theme, which at the minute is just empty. So we can just say theme and do that for now. And what we're going to do, we're going to return an array of string null. There we go. So that should all clean up a little bit. So now if we come back and send this, you can see that we're getting a little bit back. So how can we do this a little bit better? And you'll notice what I've probably done already out of instinct. No, I haven't. It looks like it's not wrapping by default anymore. Could that be today's update? Usually this is wrapped with data. This might be today's update. I'll have to check the release notes. As I was joining this call, I saw a post from Dries saying it was release day, and I was just thinking, what am I going to miss? Hopefully not too much. So bear with me. If things aren't quite as I expect, it's because of that. So what we're doing is we're getting an ID, we've got a name, we've got a theme. That's great. Now, let me just close some of these down. We want to go a little bit further than that, though, right? Because, you know, we're going to want a couple of extra resources in reality. So we are going to get a user resource there. So let's open that up. Here's our user resource. I am not going to fill this one in because it's kind of irrelevant at this point. You kind of understand it at this point. So we can just add sender, and we can say new user resource. And we're going to use the resource of this when loaded. And the relationship we want to use is sender. So if we come down, we can go make sure, yes, a sender will return that user. So that is all good. Now, if we send that request again, it's not being included. However, if we know we're always going to want it, we can just tag this in here with sender. And then we get that user who started or sent that first message in this case. And typically you would tidy this up, make it a little bit better. I digress. So at this point, we are getting information. It's nice. It's, you know, it's what we want to be doing. But how about any filtering options? You know, how can we potentially filter this? Do we want to leverage client-side filtering? Do we not want to leverage client-side filtering? So this isn't the nicest thing to do in Laravel without a package. This is where Sparsy's Laravel Query Builder really comes into play, and it really should just be included because it is amazing. But what you can do is you can start like with there.
I think the Welsh internet may have caught up with Steve here. I think he's going to try and reconnect here. We'll just give it a moment here.
Now we have the option to say include.
Sorry, Steve. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think on the stream you cut out for maybe 30 seconds or so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's quite all right. And we know what the humidity does to the Welsh internet. So you might just, if you wouldn't mind maybe stepping back about 30 seconds or so, I think just to catch everyone up.
Not a problem. So Sparsy's Laravel Query Builder is probably one of my favorite packages to use. It helps so much with building API, especially when you start to include relationships. Now, what we want to do, because we don't have that yet, is to use this. We want to say, okay, if the request has got the query parameter include, then we want to explode that by the comma as with, and then just replace it down here. So now when we pass in include sender, we now get that sender in and it's all okay. Now, this is where you get into different problems, because this is where you got to start to think about caching as well. But before we get to caching, let's touch on pagination and standards. So there's a lot of different standards when it comes to APIs in general. There's JSON API, there's HAL, there's JSON, LD. The list is getting bigger and bigger almost every day. And while standards are important, consistency is more important. If you find you're kind of going out of your way to try and follow a standard, it isn't worth following. As long as you're consistent, your API will be good and people will use it because it's reliable. But what we want to do, but let's ignore standards because they're not super important. Consistency is probably a lot more important to most people over standards. No one's going to say, I'm not going to use this API because it's not using JSON API, or because it's not using HAL, or it's using JSON LD and I'm not really a big fan. They're more likely to say, I don't want to use this API because it's not consistent. So if anyone ever tells you you have to follow a standard, tell them no, you don't. You just got to be consistent. But what's more important now is to look at pagination, because if I've been using this application for a while, the likelihood is that I've started hundreds upon thousands of conversations. So we want to start to paginate that information. So we automatically go, okay, just tag on paginate and it's all good, right? But if we scroll to the bottom, which isn't showing it, okay, it's not showing it because I'm returning it as a response. So let's just replace that with to response passing in the request. So here we go. So now we've got this data wrapping, but then we've got these links and all of this meta information, which is super useful for that front end. But it's not great for APIs. You're passing a lot of information here that is kind of not needed. You don't need a label or active. You just want a nice, clean pagination. Now, you could use cursor pagination. I think it's cursor paginate. And that, again, it's okay. You've got kind of pages that you can cursor through. But again, that's also not the most useful from a usability perspective. It's great for certain situations. My preferred method is to use that simple paginate and give it a limit. I'm going to set a limit of 5 for now, just so that we see it pop in. And what we have is current page, from, path, per page, and to. A lot simpler, a lot cleaner, which reduces that payload size, which would make that response quicker in the long run. So now that we're paginating, let's have a look at this. Data is not useful. I'm pretty sure a lot of us have seen it in the past where we go, okay, we're going to use Axios and we're going to say response data.data.data. It just feels wrong, doesn't it? So the first thing that we do is we open up that app service provider here and we say, okay, so any JSON resource we want to do without wrapping because it is painful to use. And apparently it is ignoring me. Never mind, we'll come back to that. So to response, what can we pass on that? That's just a request. Okay. But at this point, it's starting to get a little bit, as you just saw, I don't really want to use data. Some of these links are useful, some of them aren't. It's not really the way that I might want to do it. So this is where I go to that next step, which is, well, let's repeat this step, should I say? And let's look at better responses again. So in my HTTP controller, I will typically create a new responses directory. And again, I will version these. And I will create something like a collection response. Now, the purpose of this collection response is to make sure anytime my API is returning a collection of models, collection of entities, whatever you might want to call them, that I always respond in the same format. Now, what this needs to do is need to implement responsible, which means that we've got to add this to response down here. So we will say, let's return that Symfony response. And then down here, we can return a new JSON response where the data is going to be something, but I always like to say status. Now, I like to be very declarative with this because if you're a junior developer or you're working with people less experienced than yourselves, they might not know the correct status code to return. If you say, okay, I want you to return HTTP accepted, they might not know what that status code is and they might make a mistake. Or you might say return a 204 there because it's not that important. And they'll be confused. They won't really know the meaning behind it. But if you say, okay, so actually, no, I want that no content, or I want that accepted because reasons, it's useful to be declarative sometimes. And some people may not like my style of code, but it works for me. So we'll see on that one. Use it or don't use it, as long as you're declarative and you know the risks of other people using the code without knowing it. So in our constructor, we can pass a couple of things. We're going to start with a private read-only anonymous resource collection as a collection. And then we are going to have a private read-only int as a status. And we're going to default that to that response OK. So down here, we can remove it and make this a little bit easier to work with. And for now, we are just going to return this for data and then this data. Then we can make that a read-only class and remove that horrible old school spacing. And suddenly our API is a little bit nice to work with. So let's come back to our index controller. So if we just grab this now, what we can actually do is say return a new collection response where the data is that. And up here, we're just going to swap that to responsible instead. Now let's go and have a look at our response now. So now we're getting everything coming through, but we've lost our pagination information. So there's a little bit more you need to do. So what we want to do here is we want to take it a step further. So not only do we want to pass over the data, but we want to pass over additional things. So let's say we want to key this, and this is going to be conversations. So over in our collection response, we are going to accept a private string as the key. And then we can grab that and we can drop that down a level. And we can just say that this key is this data. So now if we come back here, send that request, conversations, we can then loop over them. And there's a lot of context. And what you've got to think about here is that API experience. How are people going to interact with your API? And to make this a little bit cleaner, I'm just going to remove that include. So it's kind of a little bit easier to look through. But it's what we want is we don't want to go, okay, response data map. We want to say request data conversations. We want to pass that context along. So that is that part, but now we're losing other parts to it. So at this point on our index controller down here, this query here, we want to pull this out. So let's say that our conversations is going to be that, and we're going to replace this part. So conversations, there we go. The company forces us to send 200 when we get no data. Oh, I have heard so many horror stories of APIs, and I've experienced so many bad APIs. Now, conversations at this point is a paginator, but it will be accepted by this, which is fantastic. But what we're able to do is if we have a look at this, we can say conversations. It gives us lots of information. So current page, first item, has more pages, is empty, last item, per page. So we can actually pass some of this along to start to build out the kind of meta information that we're going to want. So we're just going to start scaffolding this out, and we'll walk through it together. So we're going to have this meta part here. So we'll have something like a per page. I'm just going to put 1 for now. If I could write PHP, there we go, 1. 200 response, success, false. So then we're going to say, I mean, you can use current page. And I guess you could use next page if you really wanted to, but a lot of the time you kind of understand where you are. So let's have a look at that. Conversations. We can go for current page, has more pages, has pages, is empty, per page, previous page. What you really want to do is look at something like, okay, so how many do I want per page? What page am I on? And is there another page for me to get? And at this point, you want it to be a Boolean. So we can say false at that point. So if we just go have a look at that, and this is how I like to build APIs. I like to work through this and walk through and say, okay, so how does this API want to work? Unexpected token new. Oh, I left something in. We all make mistakes. I just make a lot more than you do. So here we go. We've got per page, current page, and has more. So we can start to pass that through. So we can say, okay, so how many per page? Well, we've got 5. What page are we on? Well, we can say conversations, current page. And then we can say more is conversations has more pages. And we can start to build this out. Or we could just pass through that paginator. There we go. So if we come back over to here, we can say private paginator. Make sure that's all fine there. Okay. Contracts paginator. Okay, so we want to pass through the correct thing. Make sure we pull in the correct thing. Import the contract. So then down here, we can say this paginator, we want to say per page. This paginator, current page, this paginator has more pages. And if we come back and check there, no code issues, no code issues. Come back to our API, send that request, collapse those. And now things are starting to work a lot nicer. So we moved away from having to kind of statically write these, and we're taking it a step further. Now, sometimes you will see links in that response payload, but it's not always useful. I prefer to put my links on the resource itself. So if you come over to here on the conversation resource, under sender, the last item, I usually do like an underscore links. And you can do the self is going to be root. We can say v1 conversations show this resource. And the parent root is going to be the index. Send that request again. Ooh, we died. 2 seconds. Why has that got double dots? Getting excited. I'm getting excited. There we go. Let me just root list. Did I do a typo again? I always do typos. Oh, I did a dot. Always do a dot. Send that request, and there we go. So now if we collapse conversations, we've got conversations and meta, and then specifics, you can go into conversations, links self, or links parent to go up, and to have your API to be discoverable. How to not control the success. Not 100% sure what you mean by that, but if you could explain it, I would do my best to answer it. So I think I've spent enough time explaining that part. Now we want to talk about caching. Now, caching is an interesting topic. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to replace this with the sender, because I'm always going to want that sender when they hit this endpoint. I can remove that. And this. Start to clean up, and my code is starting to make me happy again. So at this point, I know when I get a list of conversations, I always want to know who started that conversation. So I can always include the sender, which means that this resource, I could probably get away with not doing this, but I might use this resource in other places. So let me just fix that. Oh, this is going to annoy me. I apologize about my OCD, but I had to fix that. Okay, so next up, caching. So how do we actually cache this? Obviously, we can use that cache facade. But how long should we cache this for? So let's say, okay, we're going to use cache facade, and we're going to remember we can start to say, okay, conversations, some user ID goes there, and then we got a TTL, and okay, we do it for an hour, a day, whatever we might want, and then that callback is going to be. So I've been writing 2 different languages today. So there we go. So, but remember, remember just return mixed. I always get those mixed up. So, okay, we can cache that kind of easily, right? And we can send that, and that's fine. And then the next few times we send a request, it's a lot faster, and that's great. But how do we kind of determine this time, and how do we stop these nasty floating cache keys in our application? The way I like to do this is, let's start with a key. Keys, conversations, for user, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this keys is just an enum, standard enum that says, okay, I want to be able to cache conversations, I want to be able to cache friends, and these are the keys of how I want to refer to them. And then I've got this helper function of for user, so that I can get this value, this user, in a very specific format. And that's not Laravel, that's just PHP, using PHP the way it can be used. Then down here, we can do times. We're going to cache for an hour, for example. And let's get the value for that one. And this, again, is a very simple enum, nothing fantastic going on behind the scenes there. But at this point, we're like, okay, so I want to cache this for an hour because it's a heavily used application. But how often is that user going to start a new conversation or something like that? You need to think about more than just that. So let's come over to here, send it. It's all good. 79 milliseconds, 18. And now we're hitting the cache, and it's a little bit faster. Now, the timings are going to be very different because I'm using database caching. If this was in production, it would be very different. But how can we turn this into something that's, maybe a bit more managed than just floating timings within our application? And the way I like to do this is to just cache this forever. Like so. And what forever takes is, I don't even need to do that. I can just do that. And then forever returns true or false, basically. So we need to grab that data from there once it's been cached and pass this through down here, because otherwise you're just passing a Boolean. So we want to cache forever this information. We want to, for that user, here's a value. I want you to cache that forever. So now I can send that again, and it's all good. But what happens when a new conversation is started? How can we start to look at that cache management? And I'm pretty sure that is here. Oh, look at that. I knew I was going to get onto this part. So how can we cache better? So we're caching this forever, but we need some form of caching going on, something underneath the hood that's going to bust our cache or warm our cache. So what we will do is, again, leverage Laravel, because that's what we're here to learn, right? So let's say we're going to make an observer. We're going to create a conversation observer for the conversation. So now if we just open up our conversation quickly and come to the top, we can tell this that it is observed by the classes that's observing it is that conversation observer. So now Laravel knows that this conversation model is being observed by this. And what I'll do is just remove everything other than created, but you would approach it in the same way. So we've created a new conversation. So what do we need to do at this point? We want to go, okay, we've got this. So we need to bust the cache for this user. And then we want to recache or not recache. That part's up to you, that kind of the caching and not recaching. That part's kind of more up to you at this point. But because we've got a conversation and we know we've got the sender, we can start to bust that cache quite easily. So we can say cache forget key keys conversations for user, where the user is conversation sender ID. So we can bust that cache using the observer, and it's fantastic. Can we anticipate a GraphQL? Not that likely, because I'm not a big fan, but I will put my feelings for GraphQL aside, and I will plan a GraphQL thing. Don't worry. Okay, so we've busted the cache for that user. Now, do we want to cache at this point or don't we? That is a lot of the time when I'm talking about APIs and the best things to do, I always end up saying it depends. And it's very true. It depends on your use case, your business requirements, and what's going to work best for your API and your API users. So for this one, I'm not going to recache. I'm just going to bust it as soon as anyone's created, and then we can recache when they're refetched. However, when we're deploying, when we're doing other things, we might want to also start to cache some of these. So we can, again, leverage Laravel. We want to make a command. So warm conversation cache. So if we come over to our commands over here, we've got this over here. Let's just clean all of this up a minute. We can use that as command. The name is warm conversations. And we can set that description to be warm conversation cache, and then just fix that whole file. This is going to return an int, and we can just return a command success. And then we will import this one as a Symfony command. And there we go. We're getting somewhere. So what we want to do here is go through kind of all users that have conversations. We don't want to focus on conversations. We want the users at this point. So we can say for each user query where has conversations, and we want to get this as a cursor. Self-success is better. I mean, you can do self-success, but you're extending and extending, and what you really want to do is target where it really comes from. Just how I like to do it. Whatever works for you, again, at the end of the day. So at this point, we've got users. So what we want to do is start warming the cache. So how can we start warming the cache? So we can say cache we can start by forgetting, and then we can remember. So in theory, we shouldn't have to run this forget, but we will anyway. So keys conversations for user is user ID. And to help with my type completion, there we go. So we've forgotten everything. We've kind of bust the cache, and now we can say cache forever, and the key is going to be this again, and the value will be conversation query with that sender, and we just repeat the query basically. So we can then do that. So what this is going to do is going to bust the cache and rebuild the cache, and the observer will constantly bust the cache for us. So in our console routes, we can just define that. So let's just remove that inspiring because I don't need it. And what we want to do is say artisan command, and the signature is going to be warm conversations, and the callback is going to be, how is that written? I can never remember this. I think you can schedule in here. I'd have to check the docs, but in here we would then basically just say warm conversations, and then the callback would be conversations warm, and we're going to say we're going to do this daily, or we're going to do this daily at, said time. This bit is irrelevant to the API side. It's just something useful to do. You want to make sure that you are doing things correctly. So what we want to do is we want to warm the cache every so often. It could be every minute. Depends on how busy your API might be. But you want to make sure you're scheduling this cache busting cache busting command, and also you're able to bust the cache on an observer, meaning that you don't have to worry about any cache maintenance of caching it here and worrying about how often that needs to be done and any values or any time. At what point in the process does the observer run? So the observer is a Laravel internal thing. So it will listen, it's attached to a conversation. And when the created event is dispatched from Eloquent for a conversation, this method will be called. That's all in the Laravel documentation. More than happy to give you a link to that or walk you through it at some point. Reach out to me after the talk and I can walk you through that in more detail if you need it. But it's now self-managing. We've got a schedule that's busting and warming our cache for us on a timed basis. And our cache is instantly being bust every time a new conversation is being added, so that cache is never getting stale. Now, got too many files open. What's next? How about write operations? Thank you very much for dropping that link in. So let's talk about write operations, because I've spent a lot of time on that one endpoint. Controllers, v1, conversations, store controller. Store. Okay, so at this point, what we've got is, it is Mr. Modular Laravel. It is Laravel Lego Man. So when we create something, it's a very synchronous operation a lot of the time. And that might not always be the requirement. I've been building a lot of front-end stuff recently, and a lot of the time, the state that I am working with, I will manage that state internally and just alert the API of state changes, but keep my state as the source of truth until the next sync that my client app needs to do. So here we're saying conversation, we're going to write that in place. Then we're going to return it as a response and say 201 back. We want to improve upon this. What happens if 10,000 people start a conversation all at the same time? Your database is going to have a throttling point where it's going to slow down. what you could be using local MySQL, you might be using single store or planet scale or Superbase or Turso because you're cool and you like Aaron's videos. But we want to move this to the background. That is a key thing for any write operations. Push them to a background process, because 8 out of 10 times the person making that response doesn't need that data directly back. They've got that data. They're likely managing it themselves. So we can, again, make a job. So let's make a job, and we're going to say conversations, and then v1. We're just going to say create new. There we go. So this here, I'm just going to remove it. And instead, I'm going to say, I'm going to do this my way. I could just dispatch things and, do it the quick and simple way, but I'm going to write it the way that I would write it. So I would typically go private read-only dispatcher, and I'd come down to the interface, and I'd pull this in as a bus. Make that read-only, and then I can say this bus dispatch. The command that I want to dispatch is a new, create new. Like that. And then the data within there would be something perhaps different. There we go. That's what was going on. So let's go over this create new a second. We want to accept some data in here, but do we want to pass a request? Not that likely. Let's just clean that up too. So what is coming into this request? Well, we're going to have a name, a theme, and potentially a recipient. The sender is me. So what we want here, and this is what I do, don't have to do it yourself, is I start to create payloads. I'm going to create a V1 for the payloads. And then I'm going to create a new conversation. And this is where we start talking about data objects. So public function, construct. If I'm starting to run out of time, by the way, please let me know. Okay, so new conversation. What goes into it? Let's put this over here. And then we can look at this new conversation here. So we've got a name, a theme, and a recipient. And the only thing that is required is that recipient. So we can say, we're going to add a public null string for that name, a public null string for the theme, and then a public string for that recipient. And we will make this a read-only class, so it's immutable. So then we can say public function to array. When we save this to a database, we need to pass an array. But what we can do is we can pass that string for the sender in there, and then return the name, this name, theme, recipient ID there. And then we can do the sender ID is the sender. That's going to complain about the return types. So we can say string, null, and resolve that. So now we've got this new conversation. What we want to do on our request itself, which is a public function payload, and this is going to return a new conversation. Return a new conversation where the name is, let's make sure this is in focus now that we don't need to split our view. So we can say this string, let's get the name as a string. Theme can do the same. recipient is that one. And there we go. So now we've got this new conversation over in our store controller. We can say that the conversation is request payload and that the sender is that auth ID. So in our create new, we just have to accept this. We can say public read only new conversation as conversation and a public read only string as sender. Right down here, we can come over to here. What I like to do here is just pull in that database manager as database, because I like to wrap this in a transaction. So I can say database transaction. I want to attempt this a maximum of 3 times maybe. And then a callback is going to be this, conversation query create, where the attributes is going to be this conversation to array where the sender is this sender. And there we go. So now not only can our job be retried, but it will try to rewrite the database 3 times. You set this, is that at the minute is a kind of arbitrary number. I set it to 3 because I believe the default is 2. Might not be. Default could be 3. I'm not 100% sure, but is it 4? I don't know. There's a default number basically on transactions. Attempts 1. So I just choose number 3 because my wife likes a number 3 for some reason. So it's kind of what I default to. But that's very arbitrary. But what's happening is if you've got a very busy connection, that transaction will retry 3 times. And then if it fails, you know it's a problem with how you're doing it. So you can fix it and rerun the job. And hopefully, all going well, it works. So that is that part there. We're now on this. We are sending that correctly. But now this response is kind of incorrect at this point. So what I tend to do at this point is come back to my responses. And I always have something called a message response. And what this is useful for is for kind of if you ever just need to pass a message back and you want it to be standardized. So public function, we're going to do a construct here. We're going to have a private. We'll do a read only because we can, just to annoy the kind of people who don't like it. Then we're going to have a private read only int status, and we're going to say response HTTP OK by default. And down here, we're going to have a response as well. On this bit, return a new JSON response. The data is message, this message, and the status is this status. That is now all good, and we will make that read only, and we will tidy that up. So this store controller, this can now just return responsible. And for this, we can just return a new message response, and the message will be, we are processing your request, and the status, we can't use created anymore because we haven't actually created it. Now, you could go with that default of HTTP OK. There's nothing wrong with that one. But I personally like to say accepted, because what we've done is we've accepted that request at this point. We're saying we've accepted your request and we are going to have an internal process that is going to do the action which you're asking us to do. Let me just clear that up. And this is going to complain about being a string. Yeah, int string null. So, I mean, you can like cast this as a string if you want to fix that one. That part's up to you. Final read-only Savage, definitely. What about using sparses Laravel data? So the idea of this is that I'm doing this without additional packages beyond that Laravel new project. I don't want to add those additional things. I want to use Laravel and the language only to show you how far you can get. Now, you could use Laravel data. You could use a million different packages to do a lot of this. But this is how you can do it without having to, because as soon as you start requiring this package or that package, you start having to rely on them to update something, or them to fix a bug, or them to also reach that same Laravel version as you. And a lot of people will keep up with that, but a lot of people won't. Myself included, I always have a slight trail on the latest Laravel version support because I've got a lot of things to do. You know, you can't rely on it all the time. So using just the pure Laravel side and PHP allows you to not fall into that situation. But now we're going to have a much quicker response simply because we're leveraging background jobs in the right way, and we're passing back a response quickly, something that's understandable with the correct status code in a standardized way. So what other points did I have? Let me just open up that README. There we go. Was there anything else in here? API reactions. What did I mean? API reactions. Okay. Oh, I noticed I've got 20 minutes left, so I'm going to pick up the speed a little bit. So what do I mean by API reactions? So anytime you do something in an application, there is a reaction. That could be saving it to the database. It could be sending an email. I kind of just covered that. Always push it to the background is the point I wanted to make on that one. And the last one is, second, I've skipped ahead. Behavioural APIs. So I've seen a lot of APIs recently that I would class more as behavioural APIs over RESTful APIs. And what do I mean by that? So I think things like OpenAI, Mistral, those kind of LLM APIs are very behavioral driven.
I think we've had some more humidity in the pipes. Steve.
Yes.
Sorry, you cut out for maybe 10 seconds this time.
Oh, sorry.
Not a problem.
So behavioral APIs, what that is when you're asking that remote system to do something, you're not kind of doing, RESTful resource management through HTTP. You're saying, okay, LLM model, start a completion, LLM model, start a conversation, LLM model, do this, or remote system, please do something for me with this data and give me the response back. That is what I mean by behavioral APIs. And then my final point is testing. If you aren't testing your applications, did you really write the code? If you aren't testing your API, how do you know if someone's going to be able to use it? Always test. There's a lot of good helpers in PHP unit, in Pest, to test your APIs. The Fluent helpers in Laravel testing is absolutely fantastic. I don't have time to run through full testing on APIs, but I've got a lot of articles on it. There's lots of articles on Laravel News and other people have written. Go check them out. If you want to talk about API testing, reach out to me on Twitter, GitHub, wherever, and just let me know. Other than that, that is how you build performant APIs, leveraging the framework and the ecosystem. If you can, use Laravel Vapor. that kind of serverless approach will speed up your API, especially if you run Octane with it and those kind of jump boxes and configure that properly. Your API will scale very well. It's what we do where I work at Treble. We're an API analytics company, so we do lots of observability and monitoring, and we're getting about 1.4 billion requests or more a month that are just hitting our Ingress API. And that's all based on Laravel Vapor, Octane, and just a good solid stack. And it will take you far, very far. 1.4 billion requests a month is not a small amount of data. It's a lot of data. It's, daily API responses from 20, 30, 40,000 APIs, whatever we're on now. It's a lot. So understand the ecosystem and understand your framework, and your API will scale and be performant. Make sure you're not just pulling in packages because you can't be bothered to write 3 lines of code. Have a think about it. And if you're going to use final read-only classes, please don't mention it on Twitter, because you'll start the next world war that we just don't want right now in the community. But thank you all for listening. If you've got feedback, got questions, reach out to me, drop them in the chat. My gracious hosts, that is my presentation over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. That was awesome. There's so much there. First of all, one of my observations was I think you've built an API before.
Once or twice.
I think there was some comments in the chat that kind of said reflected as much that you're tooling very well, and your approach to API building is really cool to see. And I think one of those things we can all gain a lot from watching someone do something they do regularly and put a lot of thought into. So that was awesome, man. Thank you so much for that.
I've actually got a building APIs in Laravel course coming out, which is going to be completely free.
Awesome.
No cost.
Where will that be available?
All of the videos have now been edited. I just need to build a website to stick them on so that people can kind of see them.
Awesome.
If you want to kind of get notified, the Treble Twitter or Treble YouTube is going to be the best places.
Okay.
They'll just be popped out there as soon as they're ready. Otherwise, I will announce it. There's no kind of domain name or anything yet. It's very, I really should have bought something, and what am I going to do with this? I recorded a load of videos when I went to Croatia, and I'm giving them away because I want people to build better APIs.
Awesome.
Wow,
well, thank you.
That's awesome. And we'll repost them on all of our social media channels too as soon as you post them. So
thank you.
We'll spread the word.
There was one of the first things or topics that came up in your talk there, and it made me think of was just some approaches, and it was kind of littered throughout, some approaches to consistency, right? And I think that's, in my experience, is really important, especially if you're working on an API, which people often are with a team of people.
Yeah.
Right. And I know it's like some common problems if I'm on a team and we were working on something and we're less familiar with the API. One of the first questions, if we're going to add a new endpoint, it's like, where does this new thing go? Right. So I think there was some nice stuff there you showed where it seemed you were breaking out route definitions by like resource almost. Was that kind of your approach there?
Yeah.
And then there was another thing I think you mentioned was about the documentation side of things.
Yes.
And that's a big one, right? I've worked with Open API a bit, and like, do you have any general approaches or just insight for teams into how can we keep that documentation updated and make it, us lazy developers, as easy as possible, that if I add a new endpoint, I can as easily as possible add the new documentation? Do you have any tips there?
So there's a couple of ways. And I'll start with the shameless plug approach.
Those are always
what
good.
we do at Treble is API observability, and as a byproduct of that, we generate your Open API spec in real time. So any changes to your API is shown on that Open API spec, and it's absolutely great. It's hands-free. You don't have to worry about it at all. And obviously, you get the benefit of monitoring, notifications, sales pitch. You get all of the stuff that we offer at Treble. I'm not going to dive into that because this isn't the place for it. But that's one way you can do it. Another way is a really good package called Scribe, which I believe James Brooks has spoken about at a Laracon or two. That one it's a package you install and it will just generate it for you. You've got to run a command and it will generate it, and you can add it to your CI pipeline, and it's fantastic. There is another package coming out that I did see that doesn't require any PHP annotations, any doc blocks, anything. It just kind of interrogates your code. I can't comment or recommend that one yet because it's not ready. I saw it this morning when I was trawling through GitHub for useful things, and it stood out to me, and it's definitely one to watch for those who don't want to sign up for a service or manage doc blocks and attributes. There we go. Knuckles WTF scribe. It's fantastic, and you can really dive deep into how that OpenAPI spec is kind of created and formatted using doc blocks and annotations.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely also appreciate it. I need to get into using attributes a lot more myself. There was a couple there. I think the as command and observed by. I didn't even know those were things that existed. So there's some nice stuff there to
it really it helps clean up your code.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I saw I think it was Nuno who was doing something one day, and I saw him using it, and I was like, I've got to remember to use that.
I appreciate your attention to make my editor know as much about my code as I can.
100%.
Yeah.
If you can help your editor, you're helping the next person who's going to be working on that code. That's kind of my approach.
Oh yeah, I love that. And it's really great watching you work too, Steve, because there's so many things that I learned. I was like, what is this? I mean, I learn every single meetup, but I really liked when you were talking about the caching. And then one question just on the side here, I'm curious what you have to say about this, because it's very interesting to hear like what advice you'd have. But do you have any tips or advice for caching endpoints which allow filtering or sorting?
That is the tricky part. So typically what I would do there's like a guzzle method called HTTP build query. And typically what I would do is I would kind of build up my cache key based on that. But the biggest problem is obviously as soon as you're including relationships, filtering and sorting, you're getting a lot of extra cache keys. So you're building up your cache based on every small tweak. So it's not always worth it. Sometimes it's best to kind of cache the bigger picture and then filter and sort on the collection and do it that way. So it's kind of you got to pick the lesser of the two evils almost. Do I want to just cache everything and build up my cache a lot, or do I want to do pre-processing, or do I just want to disable it and let JavaScript figure it out?
Yeah. Cache invalidation. That's one of those, was it the two problems that are hard in programming? The classic joke. And that I had a similar thought and question there too, of like, how do you, I liked your approach there of using like an enum to build that simple cache key. In more sophisticated examples, are you using that same approach, or do you go further than that?
Yeah.
And then
I also sometimes go a little bit further. Like you could, that example, I've got a very simple enum with a helper method. You could pass multiple arguments into that to dynamically create that cache key a bit better while keeping some level of consistency. But it beats having lots of randomly concatenated strings floating around your app. You can manage it in one place. And
as soon as you said that, this floating key, and I was like, I've dealt with that. I've written that code myself. I've been in code bases that have that as well.
Why is this still caching? Oh, I did a typo when I wrote cache this.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think we've all felt that pain. So that's why I do it this way.
In an example where maybe there was a bit of filtering that you're caching as well, how do you leverage like tags? Like, how can I ensure that like all of the users' possible filters get cleared out when I want them to?
Yeah, leverage tags. I mean, if you get to the point where you've got a lot of different cache options, so you want to do kind of more in-depth cache management, kind of cache tags is the way to go.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I approach it. And I've been toying with the idea of building a package around this cache management stuff, but finding time is always hard.
Life catches up with you, doesn't it?
I've mentioned it now, so I'm expecting by tomorrow morning, Sparsy's probably got something, and they just forgot to publish it. So
I think they just pushed.
I mentioned it in the hopes that Frake will publish it.
We can all keep our fingers crossed. I did appreciate too, just like your attention to like, let's make the API as user friendly as possible. And the thought of like, how are people going to consume this? And I've certainly, just rely on like the data key myself. And as a joke, I always, when I start working on a front end of an application for the first time, I joke, is this a response.data? Or are we doing response.data.data on this application? And then I've even seen the third data sometimes. It gets a little crazy.
I've been there as well.
So I really appreciate it. Like you just, let's change that key to messages or converse, whatever's appropriate. And it's going to make consuming that endpoint a lot nicer as well. It's something we don't always think about when we're building up the functionality of an endpoint.
It's what I call the API experience. It's a little bit like user experience on the web, but for your API. It's a similar approach. You've got to think about that user, and it's for the same reasons. Your users are just developers instead of someone with a mouse or keyboard.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a couple other questions. Just one was just like the versioning. When you're building an API, are you typically like versioning right from the start, even before there may be a V2?
It depends on if it's a small internal API, I don't version. If it's going to be something that's publicly consumed, I always version from the start because I don't want to add breaking changes. I usually go a couple of steps further because there's a new HTTP RFC, which allows you to have like a sunset header, which allows you to control deprecations over HTTP a lot nicer. I didn't have time to show that today. I've done it on a past stream. I should probably write an article about it, but that's really useful as well because then you can start to alert people of deprecations and you pass a date as well, so it's kind of informing them when it will be deprecated. So
okay, yeah, it struck me as versioning feels like one of those things, like testing is one of them, where if you put it in place to start, you're probably going to have an easier time of it than trying to a couple years down the road add versioning to something existing potentially. Yeah.
And I had a conversation with Phil Sturgeon about this. He's in the very kind of don't version, you don't need to camp. But that's because a lot of the work he does is, tooling based around HTTP, which is, mature or new enough to understand and work with these different headers and say, okay, no, that's deprecated. You shouldn't be using that. But not everybody is doing that. So until all technology is at the same point where it can understand those headers from HTTP, I will still version because someone might be using an older bit of tech. They might be doing it in a different way that's not quite up to the modern standards for HTTP. So you got to support everyone.
Absolutely. Cool. All right. I don't know if there's any more questions in the chat. I just had one sort of curiosity question, if you have any advice here. When you were showing the shape of the response, and then you mentioned like, oh, we're sending back this extra stuff we don't need. I've definitely been guilty of that in the past, where it's like, as long as I'm sending back the data I need, there's a few extra fields and things. Who cares, right? It doesn't take much. But I think having an attention to that detail, especially if it's a public API, of like making sure your responses don't get too big and are sending back more things than you want. Do you have any approaches or tooling or monitoring to like flag if like, hey, this API response is getting a little big here, you might want to take a look at this? Is there any advice there for how to approach that?
I mean, you can manually do it. Like on the API client I was using, it tells me, how big my payload is getting, which is useful. Other than that, tooling, things like Treble and others that do observability and monitoring, they'll be able to kind of flag when a response is kind of getting a bit too big and you should think about it. Obviously, you can start to look at compression and kind of all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, there's ways to combat it, but you also got to be a little bit careful.
Yeah. I've definitely eager loaded some relationships I didn't realize I had, there's a big response there. So cool.
And you don't want to get to the point where you're just accepting any URL for those eager load relationships using that include, because you can, if you use like the Laravel query builder, for example, you can, using dot notation, you can start to kind of move around that database really quickly. And as long as the resource has been built in a certain way, it's very easy just to kind of get a lot of data.
Yeah, that's a good point. Cool. I don't know if there's any other questions you see in the chat there, Margaret.
No questions. You answered all of them as you were going through, Steve. Very impressed.
Yeah. Awesome. Well,
I've
once
done it
again,
before.
once again, Steve, I'd like to really thank you for joining us and sharing all these insights. There's a lot of really good nuggets of information there that I think we can take away in our day-to-day work as we're working with APIs. And I think I probably speak for most or everyone in the chat that we're looking forward to your forthcoming series of videos on some of this stuff. So we'll look forward.
And
Awesome.
if anyone's got questions and don't want to ask them out loud, my DMs are always open at Just Steve King. Reach out to me. I always happy to answer questions about APIs.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Steve. We just got a little bit of housekeeping to wrap up here. So we're just going to pop you backstage here. All right. And so looking ahead to next month, then we've got, I'll hand it off to you, Margaret.
Thanks, Dan. No worries. Yeah, so we got some really great speakers. We're actually going to be doing our next meetup because of Laracon US. We'll be attending it. We're going to do our Laravel Worldwide Meetup 1 week in advance of our regular scheduling. So our next one's going to be on Tuesday, August 20th, and we have Drishti and Yaz that are going to be joining us. So Drishti's going to be talking about crafting Laravel magic, mastering Eloquent, and Yaz will be talking about what the type. So if you want to find out, please join us on Tuesday, August 20th, 1 week before Laracon US. And again, if you didn't have the chance to join us for our giveaway, you can scan this QR code. This will lead you to a form where you can just enter your email and name, and you'll be, if you're selected, you'll be contacted by Lee to get your JetBrains product prize, which is a code to 1 year full subscription to any JetBrains product. And here's some other rules if you want to take a look. You can also pause your YouTube video here to read a little bit more. Then we'll finish off with the last slide here with how to stay connected with us. So our official website is meetup.laravel.com. You can also follow us on X at Laravel WW Meetup. Again, when this video goes live later today, we'll have all this stuff in the description box of this video, so you can reach out to any of us on there, which will have all of Steve's links that he just mentioned about his X, and then also my link to my socials, and same with Dan as well. And if you want to stay connected, please continue to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button and add any comments of any talks that you'd like to see next. We're happy to reach out to a lot of people in the community and get some great talks for everybody. So thank you.
All right. And with that, we're going to wind things down here in the July 2024 edition of the Laravel Worldwide Meetup. Thanks again to our speaker, Steve McDougall. There was so many great insights there I think we can take away in our day-to-day work. And thanks to everyone for tuning in and checking out the stream. Looking forward to next month to our couple of speakers and hopefully catching up with some people in person at Laravel US in Dallas.
See you there.
All right. Bye now.